Imagine standing on the deck of the JSDS Izumo. You are looking at a massive, flat-top vessel spanning nearly 250 meters. On the runway, state-of-the-art American F-35B stealth fighters are engaged in takeoff drills. By any standard military definition on Earth, you are standing on an aircraft carrier, a potent symbol of offensive power projection. But if you turn to the official standing next to you and ask what this ship is, they will correct you with absolute straight-faced seriousness. This is not an aircraft carrier. It is a helicopter destroyer. Why? Because under this country's law, an aircraft carrier simply cannot exist. It's a surreal moment of cognitive dissonance that traces back to a specific room in 1947. American generals, standing in the ashes of a devastated Tokyo, drafted a constitution that explicitly forbade Japan from ever maintaining an army, navy, or air force. It was proudly hailed as a masterpiece of forced pacifism. But here's the twist that makes the history feel almost like a dark satire. Just 3 years later, the Korean War exploded. The very same Americans who had outlawed the Japanese military suddenly realized they had created a strategic vacuum. They did a frantic 180-degree turn, essentially begging the Japanese government, please ignore what we wrote, build an army and do it right now. That instant panic reversal from you must never be armed to why aren't you armed yet created a bizarre, lingering paradox. It birthed a nation that today possesses one of the most technologically advanced military forces on the planet while legally pretending that it doesn't actually have one. It forces us to look past the hardware and ask a much more uncomfortable question. Is true pacifism actually possible in a world that runs on power, or is it just a semantic game we play until the shooting starts?
That's the perfect way to frame it. The ultimate security paradox, isn't it? You have this almost unbearable tension between a country's legal idealism and the geopolitical reality it faces every single day.
And the reality is that they have to possess this kind of hardware, even if they have to, rename it.
Exactly. It just proves that security is rarely, if ever, a purely self-contained thing. It almost always relies on something external, whether that's a formal military alliance or just an unstated guarantee from a superpower.
And that Japanese paradox, that whole situation with the Izumo, it really forces us to look beyond the ships and the planes and ask a bigger question. If you can't guarantee your own security, do you always have to rely on someone else's power?
Which leads us directly into what this deep dive is all about.
Right. We're going to investigate that exact paradox of nations that rely on these external security guarantees. We've talked about Japan, but we'll also look at Costa Rica, which might be a surprise. And then we're going to contrast that model with China's comprehensive national security framework.
Yeah, our mission here is to really understand China's holistic approach. They are, I think, attempting to solve this very paradox of reliance, but they're doing it by completely redefining what security even means.
So it's not just about military power.
Not at all. It's about integrating diplomacy, economic weight, non-military initiatives. So we're going to unpack their specific tools, things like the Belt and Road Initiative and the newer Global Security Initiative, to really see how they're trying to build a new integrated security architecture in Asia.
An architecture designed to make that external dependence, obsolete.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's start where you began, with Japan. And the cornerstone of that whole contradiction is Article 9 of their constitution. It's often called this masterpiece of forced pacifism.
And it really was. I mean, after the absolute devastation of World War II, the Constitution laid it out in two very short, very clear clauses. First, the Japanese people forever renounce war. And second, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. It's incredibly explicit.
It was designed to be the ultimate firewall against Japanese militarism ever returning.
It was. But that firewall, that powerful legal language, it only held for about 3 years. Because in 1950, the Korean War just explodes onto the scene, and the entire strategic map of Asia is instantly redrawn.
And the U.S. realizes its mistake.
A massive mistake from their perspective. They realized that by demanding total demilitarization, they had left this huge, strategically vital nation completely defenseless right on the front lines of the Cold War.
It's just an astonishingly fast 180. The same Americans who wrote Article 9 were suddenly putting intense pressure on Japan to build up its own forces.
They were essentially saying, the paperwork is nice, but forget the paperwork. The reality has changed.
And out of that tension, the Japan Self-Defense Forces, the JSDF, was born in 1954.
Right. And today, let's be clear, the JSDF is not just some local police force. It is one of the world's most capable, most technologically advanced military forces. It consistently ranks in the top 10 globally for budget and technology.
Yet, On paper, it's still technically not a military. It's a self-defense force.
It's the ultimate high-stakes semantic challenge. It's this constant negotiation between the law and, geopolitical necessity.
And that necessity is only getting more urgent. You look around the region, you have China's rapid military modernization, North Korea's missile programs, the ongoing instability around the Taiwan Strait.
All of that pressure means that reinterpreting Article 9 isn't just a legal exercise anymore. It's become a geopolitical survival mechanism.
For decades, the rule was absolute, right? Japan could only defend itself if it was directly attacked.
Correct. But that started to erode over time, and it reached this really pivotal moment in 2014 under the former Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. His cabinet made a decision that was hugely controversial, but absolutely crucial.
And that was a decision to allow for limited participation in collective self-defense.
Yes, and we should pause on that because that phrase collective self-defense, that is the key philosophical line that was crossed.
Okay, so unpack that for us. What does that mean in practical terms, and why was it such a big deal inside Japan?
Practically, it means that for the first time since 1947, Japan could legally use force to defend an ally. And let's be specific, they mean the United States, if that ally was attacked, and if that attack also posed an indirect threat to Japan's own survival.
So give me an example.
Okay, so imagine a U.S. warship is in the waters near Japan, protecting Japanese sea lanes. An adversary fires a missile at that American ship. Before 2014, it would have been illegal for a JSDF vessel to shoot that missile down. After 2014, that action became permissible.
So it's a compromise.
It's a very reluctant compromise. It's aimed at keeping the U.S. alliance strong because that alliance provides the nuclear umbrella Japan depends on, while still trying to claim that they're sticking to the spirit of the pacifist constitution.
And you can see this conflict playing out in the hardware itself.
Yeah.
We started this conversation with the Izumo-class ships.
Right. Originally, they were designed as helicopter destroyers. Their job was anti-submarine warfare, disaster relief, very defensive-sounding missions.
But now they're being converted to carry F-35B stealth fighters.
And that conversion changes everything. The F-35B is a STOVL jet short takeoff and vertical landing. It's a fifth-generation fighter designed for power projection. When you put a squadron of those on a flat-top deck, you have, for all intents and purposes, turned that ship into a small aircraft carrier.
Which pushes the definition of defensive to its absolute limit.
It does. For Japan, the security guarantee from the U.S. depends on being a capable, equipped partner. And they have to do that regardless of the constitutional niceties.
This strategic ambiguity, this kind of legal fiction, it isn't just about ships and treaties. It's created a kind of intergenerational identity crisis in modern Japan.
It absolutely has. You can really see it if you look at three distinct generations grappling with this. First, you have the grandfather's generation, the people who survived the war.
For them, any kind of military is a threat.
An existential threat. They saw the imperial army lead the nation to absolute ruin. So for them, security means the literal formal absence of military force. Security is about avoiding that kind of catastrophe ever again.
Then you have the next generation, the son's generation, the ones who built the post-war economic miracle from the 50s through the 80s.
And they completely redefined security. For them, security wasn't about tanks and ships. It was about economic dominance. It was about technological innovation, prosperity. Their national shield wasn't the army, it was the assembly line.
And the American nuclear umbrella?
It was a necessary cost. Maybe a bit humiliating, but it allowed them to focus entirely on the economy.
And that brings us to today, to the contemporary figure you mentioned, the young officer Akari.
Right. And she really embodies the modern conflict. She probably joined the JSDF because of its reputation for humanitarian aid. The JSDF's response to the 2011 tsunami was incredible, and it really solidified its image as a force for protection, not for war.
Her idealism is based on service.
Exactly. But now her training involves complex joint exercises in the Philippine Sea. She's practicing logistics and coordination for a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So she is living this contradiction every day, trying to reconcile her identity as a protector in a pacifist nation with the hard geopolitical reality that she has to be a combat-ready soldier.
It's a really profound dilemma, and the takeaway is pretty clear. Japan's security is fundamentally defined by its reliance on the U.S. They are, in effect, leasing their strategic sovereignty in exchange for stability.
And to see just how powerful that external guarantor model can be, let's zoom out to the other extreme. Let's look at maybe the purest form of pacifism, the Costa Rican model.
Right. They abolished their military voluntarily back in 1948. Their entire national security strategy rests on neutrality and multilateral institutions like the UN and the Organization of American States, the OAS.
Costa Rica is often held up as the ideal, right? The
What?
proof that a country can thrive without an army.
Yeah.
But even that principled stance was put to an existential test during the conflicts in Central America in the 1980s.
Yeah. You're talking about the Nicaraguan crisis.
That's a key test case. In 1985, Sandinista troops from Nicaragua actually crossed the border and occupied Costa Rican territory. Costa Rica mobilized its public force, which is basically a police force.
So their defense wasn't military?
Not at all. It was purely diplomatic. They immediately went to the OAS. They called for emergency sessions. They used fact-finding missions to expose what was happening. And that diplomatic pressure worked. Nicaragua withdrew pretty quickly.
But if you peel back the layers of that diplomatic success, you find something else, don't you?
You do. You find the critical, often unstated backstop, the implicit threat of the United States.
That's the piece that's often overlooked.
Absolutely. The U.S. was deeply invested in containing communism in Central America. They saw the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua as a direct threat. So Costa Rica's neutrality was, in reality, implicitly guaranteed by massive U.S. strategic interests.
If Nicaragua had pushed further, it would have risked American intervention.
Without a doubt. The U.S. had bases in Honduras, naval forces nearby. Prolonged Nicaraguan aggression would have crossed a red line for Washington.
So you have to imagine that Costa Rican Civil Guard officer Mateo standing on that remote border in 1985. His real security wasn't his rifle.
No. His real security was the political will and the implied military might of a superpower thousands of miles to the north.
And that experience just hammers home the lesson. Both Japan, with its high-tech, quasi-military, and Costa Rica, with its total demilitarization, they both prove that security ultimately rests on an external guarantor.
And that dependence, that reliance, it inevitably limits your absolute strategic sovereignty. It limits your freedom of action.
And it's precisely this reliance that China's new security doctrine is designed to, well, to obliterate.
That's right. This brings us to China's Comprehensive National Security, or CNS. They are fundamentally challenging this entire model of external dependency.
They're trying to build a system where they define their own destiny.
To really get CNS, you have to understand the intellectual framework behind it. Beijing looks at the world today and sees deep volatility. They see what they call worsening deficits in peace, development, security, and governance.
They see interconnected risks.
Exactly. Everything from financial crises to climate change to pandemics. And they believe these risks require a much broader state response than just traditional military power.
So China frames CNS, which was introduced by President Xi Jinping back in 2014, as the necessary stabilizing answer to all this global disorder. How far does their definition of security actually stretch?
It is truly holistic. We're talking about 12 different areas. It goes so far beyond just borders and armies.
12 dimensions, that's an enormous scope.
It is. We're talking about the obvious ones. Political, military, economic, social, but also technological and cultural. And then it expands into fields like ecological security, resource security, nuclear, data, space, and even deep-sea security.
So what's the strategic significance of grouping all of these disparate things under one single umbrella of national security?
It's the ultimate justification for centralized, coordinated state power. When everything from building a high-speed rail line to the content on social media to protecting your supply of rare earth minerals is defined as a national security issue.
Then the state has enormous justification to intervene, to allocate resources, to force coordination across every sector of society.
Precisely. It ensures that no element of state power, whether it's a huge tech company or a small research lab, is operating outside of the national security goals.
Let's dig into a couple of those dimensions that go beyond the traditional military sphere. What about something like cultural security?
Cultural security is seen as vital because it connects directly to ideological stability and political control. It's about protecting what they call the Chinese spirit and, crucially, the absolute leadership of the Communist Party of China, the CCP, from any kind of ideological infiltration from abroad.
So they see it as essential for social harmony.
Yes, they believe internal stability has to be shielded from what they've called spiritual pollution.
Okay. And in the current climate of great power competition, I imagine technological security has become a top priority.
It's treated as a survival imperative. This means an intense focus on self-reliance in cutting-edge fields like artificial intelligence, big data, and especially semiconductors.
And by placing it under the CNS framework, an issue like the U.S. limiting access to advanced chips isn't just an industrial problem.
It's not. It's elevated to a national security crisis that demands an immediate all-of-government response. The stakes are defined as nothing less than national survival.
And what about those newer frontiers? Things like space security or deep-sea security?
Those are all about securing future advantages. Space security is about protecting your satellites, which are vital for communication, for navigation like their Beidou system, and for military surveillance. Deep-sea security is about future resource exploration, ensuring access to minerals and energy on the seabed and monitoring strategic naval movements. They're trying to secure the strategic high ground of tomorrow, today.
This entire expansive concept seems to rest on one fundamental idea: that development and security are two sides of the same coin.
They are inseparable. They use the analogy of the two wings of the same body or the two wheels of the same engine. High-quality economic development is seen as the foundational security asset.
Because a strong economy gives you resilience. It gives you resources.
And it builds public support. Without development, security is brittle.
And the reverse is also true. Robust security is the absolute prerequisite for sustainable growth.
Exactly. Any kind of insecurity, whether it's internal social unrest or external aggression, will immediately halt your economic progress. So for them, a stable, growing economy is a national security policy in and of itself.
But even within this holistic structure, there has to be a hierarchy of priorities.
Oh, there is. And it's very clear. The ultimate non-negotiable priority is political security.
Which
means the defense of the absolute leadership of the Communist Party of China and the socialist system itself. All other security concerns, economic stability, military modernization, data protection, all of them are subordinate to the perpetual goal of regime security. If a choice has to be made between, say, economic growth and political control, control wins.
Yeah.
Every time.
And that political mandate must inform their entire military approach, including the modernization of the PLA and their doctrine of active defense?
It does. The military is modernizing at an incredible pace. But its doctrine, active defense, is deeply integrated with these political goals. In theory, it means China adheres to a defensive military strategy. They maintain they will not fire the first shot.
Yes.
But that adherence allows for what they call firm and robust responses to safeguard their vital interests.
So if the doctrine is officially defensive, how do they justify building obviously offensive capabilities? I'm talking about aircraft carriers, long-range ballistic missiles.
The justification is deterrence through capability. The idea of active defense is to build sufficient strength to deter any potential adversary, not through alliances, but through the threat of an immediate, overwhelming counter-response. It's about relying entirely on China's own strength.
And they present this buildup as a necessary response to outside threats.
Right. They frame it as a direct response to what they perceive as external threats and what they often call strategic encirclement by the West.
What kind of evidence do they point to for that encirclement?
They frequently point to specific strategic moves by the U.S. and its allies. For instance, they'll highlight the increased freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, the deepening of the Quad security dialogue between the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India.
And also the deployment of actual hardware.
Yes, tangible deployments. A key example they cite is the recent U.S. deployment of the Typhoon missile system in the Philippines. From Beijing's perspective, these are not defensive moves. They are seen as provocative acts of containment, which in turn justifies China's own military buildup as purely necessary and defensive under their CNS framework.
Okay, so the genius of the CNS doctrine, then, is its ability to project power and shape the world through non-military means. The military component is for deterrence, but the active tool for shaping the regional security architecture is the economy.
And specifically, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
The BRI is the epicenter of this entire ambition.
It is. I mean, the scale is just immense. It aims to improve economic prospects and stability for over 2/3 of the world's population across more than 125 countries. And it's promoted using this philosophy of win-win cooperation.
Which is an intentional contrast with what China portrays as the U.S. America First posture.
A very intentional contrast. The BRI is positioned not just as a series of trade routes, but as an integral part of China's national rejuvenation and as a global public good.
So the strategic logic isn't just about getting market access for China, it's about exporting their own development model to create stability abroad.
That's the core thesis. The idea is that massive investment in infrastructure ports, railways, power plants generates economic growth. That growth leads to poverty reduction and job creation. And crucially, that leads to greater domestic, social, and political stability in all of these partner countries.
And stable, prosperous partners become reliable security assets for China.
They're effectively making the case that shared economic prosperity is the most sustainable form of security you can have.
I remember reading an example that really brought this to life, showing how local economic stability is being explicitly baked into the planning for these giant infrastructure projects.
Yeah, you might be thinking of the story about the diplomat, let's call her Li. She was working on a major BRI port project in Southeast Asia, and she was reviewing these blueprints that were all about maximizing shipping capacity and GDP metrics, pure economics.
But she saw a problem.
She did. Guided by these holistic security principles, she recognized that just maximizing the economic numbers often ignores local social stability, which is a key component of CNS. So she went and met with local community leaders who were terrified of being displaced, of losing their traditional livelihood.
So what was the practical intervention she made?
Well, she successfully argued for adjusting the port's design to include two elements that were not, strictly speaking, economically optimal. First, protected fishing zones for the local fishermen, and second, a vocational training center for traditional artisans.
Things that wouldn't necessarily maximize profit, but would build social trust.
Exactly. The local mayor, who was skeptical at first, later said something like, "We aren't just building with concrete, we're building social trust." It's a perfect example of how China is consciously trying to integrate long-term social stability as a core security goal. They're trying to lower the temperature of geopolitical tensions by solving local problems through economic inclusion.
And that kind of tailored diplomacy then feeds into deepening regional ties with blocs like ASEAN.
Absolutely. When you enhance economic cooperation, whether it's finalizing a new free trade agreement or exporting renewable energy technology for the ASEAN power grid, you deepen interdependence. You link the entire region's development directly to China's framework, which makes the cost of any potential conflict extremely high for everyone involved.
Okay, let's turn to the seaborne counterpart, the Maritime Silk Road, or MSR. This is where one of China's core strategic vulnerabilities really comes into focus: energy security.
Yes, this is what's famously known as the Malacca Dilemma.
A term coined by former President Hu Jintao.
Right, back in 2003. And the dilemma is this. China is massively reliant on foreign oil. Over 70% of its crude oil is imported. And the vast majority of that oil has to travel through very narrow sea lines of communication, or SLOCs. The most famous one is the Strait of Malacca. Back in 2016, something like 80% of China's energy imports passed through there.
And the dilemma is that this choke point is incredibly vulnerable. It could easily be blockaded by, for example, the U.S. Navy in a conflict.
It's an enormous strategic vulnerability. So the MSR aims to mitigate that risk in two ways. First, by building land-based alternatives like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. And second, by generating so much economic and political dependence in the countries along these sea lanes
that it would become politically and economically costly for any of them to participate in a U.S.-led blockade.
Exactly. You use economic influence to reduce your military vulnerability.
Now, when we look at some of these strategic BRI ports, Gwadar in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, this is where the narrative shifts, and we start hearing the Western criticism about debt trap diplomacy.
Right, that phrase, which was coined by the Indian strategic scholar Brahma Chalani, it suggests that China is intentionally lending money to countries knowing they'll default. The idea is that Beijing can then seize the strategic asset, like a port, and use it for military access.
But it's interesting to see how China has responded to that accusation over the years.
It is. Since about 2019, you've heard Chinese officials increasingly stress the need for financial sustainability and more flexibility in these projects.
So why the change? Is that just good PR, or is it a recognition that the original strategy had a flaw?
I think it's a strategic recognition. Because instability, even if it's caused by overwhelming debt, fundamentally undermines the CNS goal of regional stability. If a partner nation defaults and you have massive protests in the streets, that creates chaos. And chaos is a security risk for China. A politically unstable port is not a reliable asset economically or militarily.
So the renewed focus on win-win and sustainability is an attempt to ensure the economic benefits actually translate into reliable, long-term political security.
I think that's exactly right.
Now, beyond trade and infrastructure, China is also elevating what are called non-traditional security issues, NTS, as a diplomatic tool. We're talking about things like climate change, terrorism, pandemics.
NTS is a brilliant diplomatic tool for them because these are issues that transcend national borders. They demand multilateral solutions. And by taking a leading role, China positions itself not as a rival trying to tear down the global system, but as an indispensable partner needed to reform it and manage these shared global challenges.
And we see this most clearly with climate change, where a shared threat can actually become a catalyst for cooperation.
Absolutely. China actively calls for stronger international cooperation on climate, linking it directly to things like food security. And you can see how this plays out in practice, how a shared danger can actually supersede traditional geopolitical rivalries.
I was just reading about a collaborative effort facilitated by China to set up a regional early warning system for extreme weather based in Shanghai.
Exactly. Imagine a team of scientists and meteorologists from all over Asia working together in that center. One of the participants, a Filipino scientist named Dr. Cruz, he recounted how just a few years earlier, he would have seen any Chinese technology or data through a lens of deep suspicion and strategic rivalry.
But the reality of climate change, stronger typhoons, rising sea levels, it forces a different kind of thinking.
He said something to the effect of, when the water is rising, you don't ask about borders. You ask about the fastest way to get to higher ground. Their collaboration went beyond just sharing storm data. They started developing standardized disaster response protocols, something that had been blocked by political friction for years.
So the shared non-military threat created a common enemy.
And in doing so, it forced them to build these bridges of technical cooperation, which then serve as powerful political confidence-building measures. That is China's NTS strategy in action, building a cooperative security architecture out of shared necessity.
And we see this same pattern in the digital world with the digital Silk Road, the DSR, and the issue of cybersecurity.
Right. Cybersecurity is clearly treated as a vital national interest under CNS. And the DSR is this focused campaign by state-backed tech giants like Huawei and ZTE to export their technologies, things like 5G infrastructure, and very importantly, the Beidou satellite system.
And the Beidou system is a huge deal, right? It has significant dual-use capacity.
It's highly significant. By 2019, the Beidou system had 35 active satellites, officially surpassing the American GPS system in terms of regional coverage. So it serves China's national security needs while also serving the development goals of the BRI, providing navigation for shipping, infrastructure, and military applications. And exporting that technology naturally creates influence and a degree of technological dependence.
So when a digital crisis occurs, China can then leverage that position diplomatically to promote its vision for how the internet should be governed.
Let's imagine a scenario. A massive cyber attack hits the essential medical infrastructure of a country neighboring China, hospitals, pharmaceutical supply chains. It instantly becomes a humanitarian crisis. Immediately after, Chinese diplomats initiate a quiet, high-level forum focused on cyber governance.
So instead of pointing fingers, they focus on finding a solution under their CNS framework.
Exactly. They strategically use that moment of shared vulnerability. They frame cybersecurity not as a competitive military domain, but as a mutual responsibility. The Chinese representative might then propose a regional digital peace pact with shared threat intelligence and a commitment not to harbor hackers targeting civilian infrastructure.
That's a masterful diplomatic move. It shifts the entire dialogue away from digital warfare and toward protecting shared societal foundations.
It absolutely is, and it directly supports their concept of cyber sovereignty. China advocates for multilateral governance of the internet, but also promotes the right of individual governments to regulate their own cyber domain as they see fit. And that model is very appealing to countries like Egypt, which has signed agreements with China focused on collaboration in cyberspace governance, including strategies for content management.
It's a model that offers efficient digital development alongside strong domestic control,
Which, for many governments, is a very attractive proposition.
So all of these different initiatives, the economic, the technological, the non-traditional security, they all feed into China's overarching diplomatic blueprint for the world, which is the Global Security Initiative, or GSI.
Yes, the GSI, which was launched in April of 2022, is really the primary vehicle for exporting this comprehensive security philosophy to the rest of the world. It's defined as strategic guidance for achieving what they call the community of shared future for mankind.
And Beijing claims it has the support of over 100 countries.
They do. It's their attempts to put all these ideas about global security governance into practice on a global scale.
And the GSI directly challenges the established U.S.-led order through 6 core commitments. These are designed to be a normative challenge, aren't they?
Very much so. The GSI champions common and cooperative security, respect for sovereignty, abiding by the UN Charter, taking legitimate security concerns seriously, peaceful resolution of disputes, and maintaining both traditional and non-traditional security.
And by focusing on things like multilateralism and non-alignment, China is presenting the GSI as a more equitable alternative to the U.S. system of alliances.
Right. But there's a critical and very subtle tension built into the language of those commitments, specifically between the idea of common security and indivisible security.
Okay, let's unpack that. What's the difference and why does it matter?
So common security is defined very inclusively. It means respecting and ensuring the security of each and every state. Indivisible security is the idea that one state's security cannot and should not come at the expense of another's.
And the tension arises when one state's legitimate security concern threatens another state's security.
Precisely. Let's use a hypothetical. Imagine 2 neighbors, a large state A and a smaller state. State A, citing its own need for technological security under its CNS doctrine, deploys a sophisticated missile defense system on its border. That's a legitimate concern for self-defense.
But State B, the smaller neighbor, immediately sees that as an overwhelming threat. It jeopardizes their indivisible security.
They assume the system is really aimed at them. Now, under the U.S. alliance system, State B would probably seek a military pact with a major power to balance against State A.
But under the GSI framework, China steps in with a different message.
Right. China steps in and says, both of your concerns are legitimate. We must use peaceful resolution and respect sovereignty. By emphasizing consultation and avoiding alliances, China can argue that any external military intervention like bringing in NATO or the Quad violates the spirit of common security and is a form of group politics.
So it allows China to position itself as the reasonable mediator while simultaneously defining its own core interests, like its territorial claims, as non-negotiable, legitimate security concerns.
It's an explicit diplomatic framing positioned directly against U.S. policy. The launch of the GSI was immediately coupled with rhetoric about rejecting the Cold War mentality, opposing unilateralism, and saying no to group politics and bloc confrontation. It was a direct shot at alliances like NATO and the Quad.
And the Chinese state media immediately amplified that message.
Oh, absolutely. Xinhua reports framed the GSI as the antidote to U.S. hegemony and its perils. They published articles accusing the U.S. of actively destabilizing the world by overstretching the concept of national security, imposing unilateral sanctions, and wrecking the global peace framework by forming these exclusive blocs.
So the ultimate goal here is to discredit the U.S. and its alliance system.
It is. It's to open up space for China to position itself as a necessary diplomatic and political alternative, especially for the developing world, for nations that may feel marginalized by the current security architecture. It's a classic delegitimization strategy. You sow doubt about the dominant security guarantor to make your own alternative seem much more appealing.
But while the GSI is a strong diplomatic blueprint, the actual implementation has been a bit more challenging. It seems its reception has been mixed, especially when you compare it to the BRI.
That's a major hurdle. The BRI produces tangible things. You can see the port, you can drive on the railway. Security outcomes are much less visible, much more abstract.
And we see this clearly in Southeast Asia, which was supposed to be a GSI pilot area.
Right. Support there is deeply uneven. You have 5 ASEAN members, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, that have formally expressed support. But the key strategic states in the region are much more cautious.
You're talking about countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand.
Exactly. They have opted to just take note of the GSI or to explore cooperation. They're very happy to have China as a development partner through the GDI, the Global Development Initiative. But they're far more wary of accepting China as their primary security partner.
Because they're afraid it would compromise their strategic autonomy or complicate their relationships with the U.S. and Japan.
That's the core fear. And you see it reflected in public opinion polls. A 2023 survey in the region showed that about 44% of respondents had little or no confidence in the GSI. They were afraid it would either increase U.S.-China tensions or, even worse, force them to choose a side.
And this resistance isn't just in Southeast Asia. China has struggled to get consensus in broader organizations, too.
It has. In groups like the SOA, BRICS, and the GCC, it's been difficult. You noted that India, Brazil, and South Africa all declined to publicly endorse the GSI in BRICS joint statements.
And why is that? Why the resistance from those major developing powers?
Primarily because the GSI's explicit anti-U.S. framing is just too aggressive for them. These are countries that pride themselves on their strategic autonomy. They want good relationships with all the major powers. India, in particular, is deeply skeptical of any security framework that seems to solidify China's dominance in Asia, especially given their own ongoing border disputes.
So the challenges aren't just diplomatic, they become very real, very physical on the ground. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, seems like the perfect case study of how this economic security vision creates incredibly complex military risks.
CPEC is the flagship BRI program. It's intended to be the ultimate solution to the Malacca dilemma, linking Gwadar Port on the Arabian Sea directly to Xinjiang in western China. But it is exposed to massive internal security risks that are rooted in local grievances and terrorism.
Let's talk about the Balak separatists, the BLA, and their specific issues with CPEC.
The BLA views CPEC as an instrument of what they call colonization by the Pakistani national government. They argue that these massive infrastructure projects are being built on their land, but they bypass local communities, they don't employ BLOC workers, and they drain resources from the region without sharing any of the economic benefits.
And they see China as an accomplice in this.
An accomplice to resource exploitation. And this deep local resentment has translated directly into violent attacks targeting Chinese interests.
We've seen them target Chinese personnel and facilities directly.
Repeatedly. These have been high-profile attacks. The assault on the Chinese consulate in Karachi in 2018, the attack on the Pearl Continental Hotel in Gwadar in 2019, which housed a lot of Chinese workers. These incidents show that even if a project has immense economic potential, if you fail to secure local legitimacy, you turn that asset into a security liability. It directly undermines the CNS goal.
And this whole situation has forced China into a very difficult position regarding one of its core diplomatic principles, non-interference.
This is the central contradiction that really challenges the credibility of the GSI. To protect CPEC, which is defined as a core national security asset, Beijing has reportedly had to depart from its non-interference policy.
Right.
They've engaged in direct, non-public talks with various BLOC militant groups. They've been courting tribal leaders to try and secure project sites.
So when China's own self-reliance project is threatened, the non-interference principle becomes flexible.
It becomes negotiable. And this signals a fundamental shift. It shows that China recognizes that security in the real world requires proactive engagement, even if that contradicts your official rhetoric. Securing their own interests takes priority.
And as if that weren't complicated enough, China's domestic policies, specifically the suppression of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, creates an overlap that fuels religious extremism aimed at CPEC.
That's right. The intense suppression in Xinjiang provides a powerful rallying cry for transnational militant groups like ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda. And these groups have specifically targeted Chinese nationals in Pakistan in retaliation for Beijing's policies. It shows just how interconnected CNS is. A domestic political security priority maintaining control in Xinjiang inadvertently creates a major overseas economic security risk.
And finally, CPEC runs directly through the disputed territory of Gilgit-Baltistan, which brings India into the picture.
Right. India sees CPEC as a direct encroachment of sovereignty because the route goes through land that New Delhi claims as its own. This just hardens India's already negative view of the BRI as a strategic encirclement scheme. So the flagship project of the BRI actually risks sparking a regional war between two nuclear powers over a border dispute.
It's a powerful lesson that self-reliance doesn't mean immunity from external complexity.
The key takeaway is this. All these risks and challenges show that China is actively transforming. It's moving from a nation that integrated itself into the existing global order. Following Deng Xiaoping's famous advice to hide your capacities and bide your time, to a nation that is now actively constructing its own global framework. It is trying to become the self-guarantor of its own security.
So we've observed this dramatic shift in how nations approach global security. On one side, you have countries like Japan and Costa Rica, whose security is profoundly defined by their reliance on an external, powerful guarantor, forcing these difficult compromises on their own sovereignty and identity.
And then on the other side, you have China, which is actively building this incredibly complex holistic framework, the CNS, which is intended to completely eliminate that kind of dependence.
China isn't just modernizing its military. It's using soft power, its massive economic weight, its diplomacy on non-traditional security, and the very definition of security itself as tools to build a new regional architecture.
an architecture where its core interests are secured through this interconnected web of economic and political dependencies. The message is that the benefits of cooperating with China are increasingly tied to accepting the comprehensive framework that China provides. Prosperity and stability are secured by and linked to the political will of Beijing.
The conscious construction of this comprehensive security system marks the ascent of a geopolitical model where long-term stability is sought not through traditional military alliances, but through integrated political, economic, and technological self-reliance, fundamentally reshaping the strategic landscape for all nations operating in the 21st century.